What if the 24-70 wasn't the boring lens that a lot of people make it out to be? What if it's exactly what you need? In this video, I'm going to be making the case for the 24-70, and not as a replacement for prime lenses, but really as an addition to them. But I'm going to try to convince you of the usefulness and the point of the 24-70 and show you that it isn't necessarily the boring lens that it often gets labeled as. Now, the 24-70 often gets labeled as a sort of nowhere lens. It's just a mid-range focal length. It's not wide enough to be interesting, and it's not long enough to be able to isolate. So often people think that wider lenses and longer lenses are inherently more interesting. Yep, I think there's some sort of truth to that, but still, I think we need to dig in a little bit as to what's going wrong that people are ending up with boring pictures. One of the issues, I think, is that people end up slamming the lens from 24-70 and not using the focal length so much that they're in between. You see, a lot of people will tell you that they really love 50mm and they really love 35mm and they really love 24mm, yet they still find the 24-70 boring. That doesn't quite fit if you like those other focal lengths. Then this lens should actually really appeal to you in many ways. In the flow of a shoot, you're trying to take pictures spontaneously, your camera goes down, it comes back up. And when it comes back up, it's wherever you left it. Often we're not remembering where it was. You see, when you're working on a prime lens, let's say you're at 50mm, you're at 50mm and you're staying there. So every time you pick it up, you know what to expect, and you're working at that same distance between you and the subject. And I think that that is where it starts to get interesting. You see, what's happening is that you're letting the zoom do all the work. The distance your camera is away from your subject is going to change the perspective you get. So as you zoom in, you're sort of effectively cropping in from where you're standing. And if you're not aware of your distance to the subject, and you're also not aware of what the focal length is, now you've got two things that are causing a problem. You have your distance moving backwards and forwards, and then you zooming the lens to kind of get the crop that you want. Now, one of the ways that I get around this, and the way that I like to use the 24-70, and I've been working on this for some time, and it's just become a thing that I do, is I have a reference point. Now, you will see people say you can use the 24-70 as a set of primes, just setting it at the different focal lengths and using it like that. And I kind of agree with that, but I feel like I've taken it one step more towards being flexible and still being used more as a zoom lens rather than a collection of primes. So instead of just saying I'm now at 24, I'm now at 35, I'm now at 50, what I've been doing with the lens more and more is I have a default focal length that I always set it back to. And for me, that's 35mm. So I just turned it into a habit that every time I'm using a 24-70, so I'm always setting it back to 35mm. And this has a couple of effects, because what it means is that I'm always picking up the camera, and every time I look through it, I'm seeing 35mm focal length. That means that I'm paying more attention to my camera to subject distance, because I'm treating the lens now as not just a full 24-70. I'm treating it as a 35mm that can zoom, which sounds, I know that sounds mad, but when you start using it like this, you have a reference point of focal length. The problem with the 24-70 is that because you're going from slightly wide to slightly telephoto, your distance between you and the subject is a mess. And because your distance between you and the subject is a mess, you're zooming to compensate all the time, which is supposed to be the upside. But if you just do both with no care about how far you are from the subject and no care about what focal length you're at, the result is just going to be a mess. You're going to get inconsistent, boring photos that look like you didn't have any real intention when you're shooting them. So the two questions you should be asking yourself with the 24-70 is, what focal length are you at? And what is your subject distance? You don't have to do it at 35mm. You could do this at any focal length that is the common used focal length on the lens. So whatever focal length is your most commonly used with a 24-70 or a prime, what you're used to. So for instance, if you shoot 50mm with a prime a lot, but you really want the flexibility of a 24-70, make 50mm your default go-to position on the 24-70, and then you'll always be positioning yourself like you do with a prime lens. You'll get into that habit because every time you pick the camera up, you'll see 50mm and you'll be like, it will remind you to be, oh, I'm too close, I'm this far away. The next step that happens is that because you're setting it at 35 or 50 or wherever you put it, you start to instinctively control the distance between you and the subject. And that is where the magic happens. So to me, this was an evolution of the use the zoom as a set of primes, set it to 24, set it to 35, set it to 50 and use it like that, which is, I think, is a perfectly great and valid way of using it. But once I started seeing it as a prime that can zoom, by having a default reset focal length on it, then I started paying attention to always being the right distance, because in my mind I'm thinking, right, I've got a 35mm lens on me, so I'm staying at that distance. So what happens when you start paying attention to the distance between you and your subject is you start framing with more intention. You start regaining back the thing that was lost with the prime lens. Now think about this for a moment, because I know that all of the prime lens shooters, and I'm a prime lens shooter as well, don't think that this is some zooms are better or something like that. They have their flexibility and that's their speciality. The idea that a 35mm is just a wonderful lens and I can do all this stuff, and then the 24-70 is then boring, makes no logical sense. Because if you just set the 24-70 at 35mm, you can do everything that a 35mm can do in terms of, the focal length. So why does it suddenly become boring? It doesn't stack up, does it? It doesn't stack up, because you could sellotape it at 35mm and it's wonderful again, and I can do all of my framing. Well, you could do that already. What you haven't learned to do is use it in conjunction with the other focal lengths by paying attention to how far you're away from your subject. That's where the magic is with the 24-70. Now, if you find you're learning something from these tips, then please allow me to introduce the sponsor of today's video, which is Skillshare. At the moment, I'm watching Mastering Productivity with Thomas Frank, because as my business grows, I have basically no free time. So learning quickly and effectively makes a real world difference to my working life. And I've implemented his quick capture system to great effect. And so now I'm not wasting masses of time each day trying to sort through everything that's new and trying to find it all again. Now, if you don't know, Skillshare is the largest online learning platform for creatives, with thousands of classes across categories like design, photography, film, and productivity. What's really great about Skillshare is that the classes are taught by industry experts, and they know what it takes to get you from beginner up to a professional level. Skillshare has a unique approach to learning because they emphasize learning by doing, and as we all know, doing always has the best results. So you're not just watching videos, you can create projects, get feedback from the community, which is a great way to stay motivated. If you're a visual person like I am, then taking a class like this is a really great way to learn. But the biggest benefit of becoming a Skillshare member is all of those things that you've wanted to learn in the past. Being able to learn that stuff quickly and make a difference to your life, such as learning computing or a different language. Imagine how much you could learn in just 1 month. But luckily, the first 500 people to use the link in my description will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. Get started today. Now, one of the fundamental differences between a zoom lens like the 24-70 and a prime lens is also the aperture. Prime lenses have the ability to get to these really wide apertures like 1.4 and 1.2. And yes, I do think it's a big advantage, especially in low light, and also it's a different look. However, I think 2.8 for most types of photography, especially when it involves people, is more than enough. I think there is a danger with prime lenses that the blur becomes the feature of the picture. And I really think if your thing is taking pictures of people outdoors, if you're in a more dynamic environment like a built-up area, I think a 24-70 can really excel there. But to give some counterbalance to this, I still feel that if you're in an outdoor area, maybe like a beach or a field in a park or something, I still think a prime lens under those conditions is a better bet. But when it comes to doing things like travel and landscape photography, I will pick a zoom lens all day long, because zooming with your feet in a lot of landscapes just is not a possibility. So zoom lenses in those conditions, they're just always going to win out. But the one category where I think the 24-70 gets most overlooked still, and like nowadays, is for wedding photography. If you want to do events with people in, the days where you need that 1.4 or f2 aperture because of low light, they are gone. The cameras now, and even a lot of the ones from the past, like even once we got to like the 5D Mark III, the Nikon D750, the ISO performance was so good it didn't matter that much anymore. Unless, you know, you're doing like the winter weddings and things, then it can be worth it. And I think you should always have those primes in your bag. But for a large portion of the day, I mean, I'm a really experienced wedding photographer, and I'm telling you now, like 95% of the wedding day, you can just do that on a 24-70. And it's so nice photographing like that. There is a sort of an elitist attitude a little bit, I think, sometimes with prime lenses. I can be guilty of that as well myself. And this isn't to sort of hate on prime lenses in any way, but there are certain circumstances, like I mentioned before, if you're doing pictures of people and places that are in more like built up areas, zoom lenses, I mean, they're just so good for that because of the variety of pictures that you'll come back with. But also for shooting events like, you know, weddings and corporate events and so on, the 24-70 is just going to make your life so easy. If you're learning photography, I think you should learn on prime lenses because you'll understand focal length and subject distance. So I think learn on primes, get the zooms for flexibility, but keep your prime lenses. Don't become one of these, I'm only using zooms and I'm only using primes. Pick the right tool for the job. You will know that over time. And of course, if you like my pictures, you should check out my workshops in the link in the description. I have editing workshops for outdoor portrait photography, studio portrait photography, and landscape photography. Editing is one of the key areas of photography where people get to impart their own view and style into their work. It's a critical part, and all of the big photographers that have existed that you've loved the work of have been very particular about how their work is edited. And what I teach you is the way that I do my editing. So if you like the way my pictures look, it's not a generalized workshop, it's very specifically how I do what I do. So if you like my work, check out the links in the description. I'll see you in the next video. Take care. Bye bye.